Hey, I'm Allison from Learning at the Primary Pond. I'm a literacy specialist, and in this video, we are going to chat about pacing as it relates to your phonics instruction. I'm going to give you some really concrete steps to help you know how quickly or slowly to move through your phonics scope and sequence. Before we get into that, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, make sure to go ahead and do that, and then also hit the little bell so that you're notified every time I post a brand new video about teaching literacy in K2. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to need when you're thinking about pacing is a scope and sequence. A scope and sequence for your phonics instruction will just tell you like what skills you're teaching, in what order, and sometimes it'll tell you when to teach them. Now, on that topic of when, here's the interesting thing. So kids, generally speaking, as they're learning to read and write in English, they will progress through about the same sequence as far as the order of the skills. So for example, they're not going to have mastered long vowel teams before they've mastered short vowels. Like there's pretty much an order that all kids go through. But what the difference is between kids, between individual students, groups of students, classes of students, is that they progress along that trajectory at different rates. So when you're thinking about what you're going to cover in phonics for the year, in some ways you can think about it like a race. Like you have to figure out your starting point, which we'll talk about doing, and then you also have to figure out your ending point. But at the same time, with that ending point in mind, we have to keep it in our heads that we actually might not get there with all of our kids, and that's okay. What's more important is for kids to master skills versus you to just like race through all of them and try to get to some defined endpoint. Now, I know that some schools require you to stay on track, which is hard. I would talk to your admin or your coach if they are telling you have to do it in lock sequence, because the research indicates that mastery and even differentiating instruction is more important than just racing through it and covering it just to cover it, because then what happens is the kids go on to the next school year not actually having mastered whatever, grade level concepts you were supposed to be teaching, and that's of course not what we want. So let's say you've got your phonics scope and sequence. And by the way, if you don't have one, I will include a link in this or with this video so that you can grab one for free. It is based on developmental spelling and phonics research, so you can grab that one for free if you need one. But let's say you've got your phonics scope and sequence. What we now need to do is figure out where our kids currently are. And to me, what is most helpful to do is a diagnostic assessment at the beginning of the school year. Now, maybe you're not watching this at the beginning of the school year. In fact, it's likely that you're not. So it doesn't mean that everything is lost, right? Like you can give the kids a diagnostic pre-assessment at any point in the school year. And the purpose of this is really just to figure out what do they know and what do they not know yet? What are they ready for next? Now, I'm going to show you just the cover sheet. Hopefully you can see this okay. It might be kind of small. This is the cover sheet for my From Sounds to Spelling Phonics program level 1. And this is something that teachers can give at the beginning of the school year to get a sense of where kids are with their decoding, meaning their ability to read certain words, to take phonics patterns and lift them off the page to say the word, and then also spelling. So it's decoding and encoding, reading and spelling. And the reason why I think it's important to assess both is because often kids will be more advanced with their ability to decode than they are with their encoding. And so it's really important to be able to see, okay, what kinds of words can this kiddo read, but then what kinds of words can this kiddo spell? Speaking of the difference, not to go too far down a rabbit hole, if I notice that, for example, they can decode words with vowel teams, but they can only read up to if they can decode words with vowel teams, but they can only spell words up with short vowels, I'm not going to leap ahead in my scope and sequence to vowel teams. We still have to master some other stuff. So even if one comes out more advanced than the other, you want to go with the lower area, wherever they're lower, which is typically encoding. So I don't know if you could see on this page, I'll just kind of read you some things. There's different components of the assessment, and you may or may not give the whole assessment if you use the From Sounds to Spelling Phonics program, but there's phonological awareness, there's some high frequency word reading, and then there's a section called word reading. You may or may not give the whole thing, so it starts with CVC words, digraphs, blends, glued sounds, inflectional endings, and contractions, all the way up to multisyllabic words. Now, as you're giving the assessment, which does take a little while, but it's so worth it, you may notice and it'll give you guidance in the assessment, this kid has gotten 3 wrong, I think we're going to stop. Same thing with spelling. So again, it's CVC words, digraph, blends, exclude sounds. It like goes all the way up to multisyllabic words. So you're seeing like what can the kids read and then also what can they write. This assessment is a little bit different from something like a, what do you call it? It's like a fluency test or a screener. In a screener, you might be seeing like, okay, like how many nonsense words can kids read in a minute? Now that's valuable information because you're able to see like how quickly can they decode, for example. But this is really helpful as a diagnostic because it shows you exactly, oh, they can read this many words with, short vowels, or they can spell this many words with long vowel spelling patterns, right? So it gives you very specific information. Coming back to our concept of pacing, this is important because you want to start your kids on the scope and sequence where it makes sense to, because, you may have this document that's like, okay, you got to teach these skills. But if your kids haven't mastered like the precursors, or if your kids are way advanced, you want to place them on the scope and sequence based upon what their true needs are. Now, are you going to make it like 100% match for every single kiddo? No, right? Like we have to do the best that we can. Small group instruction can help with that, right? Because we can, maybe even if you have to teach whole group, maybe you can do some supplementary work in small group instruction, and maybe some of your small groups are here on the scope and sequence and others are here. And that's totally normal and totally fine. But being able to take this diagnostic assessment is a really important first step in placing your kids on the scope and sequence to begin with. Okay, so we've placed them. Now let's talk about like the speed at which we progress through the scope and sequence, because that's really important. You may have some kids that you can teach, week after week after week and they keep up, but some don't. They fall behind, or they're not mastering things, or some kids it's too easy, so you need to speed up the pace. This is where like differentiation, assessment, and kid watching really come in. So here's how we do it in the From Sounds to Spelling Phonics program. Actually, let me ask you a question. So we talked about, doing this like beginning of the year or really anytime kind of assessment to see where students are at. But I wanted to ask you, do you have something like this at your school? Let me know in the comments if you have something like this. I'm just kind of curious like how common or uncommon it is, because like I said, you might have a screener that's like how many nonsense words can they read in a minute, but this level of diagnostic assessment or diagnostic information that you get from this assessment is really helpful. So let me know in the comments, does your curriculum or does your school have a pre-assessment just like this that you can use? I feel like that's a really important tool to have. Okay, anyway, moving on to pacing. And then we were talking about, so on a weekly basis, you want to see like, okay, I've taught this. So then how are my kids doing? At the end of the week, am I ready to move on? Do I need to stay back and review? Do I even need to skip ahead? And the way that I like to assess kids, I would say this is true of like mid-kindergarten and up, is through a dictation. A dictation is sort of similar to a spelling test. I won't go down another rabbit hole and talk all about dictations, but like here's a little paper example so you can hopefully see that. In a dictation, you're telling them like sounds to write, like maybe, see here, there's 2 lines. Maybe they know 2 different ways to spell the long E sound, so they have to write them both. And then they write what they think here, and then you give them immediate feedback and they copy it over there, which is the starred. Starred means correct. So you see like, how do they do? But then they also see what the real answer is. You can do words. These are sound boxes, but you just do lines, normal lines for words. And then there's a sentence. Now this paper is from Sounds to Spelling, my phonics program, and it'll look different depending on like how old your kids are and what skills they're covering. But in essence, a dictation is a way for you to see, okay, can they encode the spelling patterns that we've worked on this whole week? And what I look for when I review their papers is, have they mastered or have they achieved a level of 80% or higher mastery? That's just kind of like a rule of thumb in the educational world. 80% and up tends to be what we consider to be mastery. And so, like if they have mastered, great, we can move on. And if not, we go back and review this some more. So this weekly information that I get doesn't take long at all, but it's extremely helpful in me for pacing the whole thing. Now, in addition to the weekly assessment, I think it's important to do an end of unit assessment as well. I don't think I brought one necessarily, but it would be something like this, where you get to see, but like on fewer skills, you get to see, okay, I taught this in the unit. Now, how are we doing with these specific skills? Again, very diagnostic, so you can see exactly what they do and what they do not know. Now, the reason why I do both the weekly and the unit is because, especially with our little ones, they can forget phonics patterns that we've been working with them on. And so what I want to see is not only have they mastered like what we just went over in the past week, but also have they retained it over the course of a unit. In From Sounds to Spelling, our units are anywhere from like, there's some smaller ones that are maybe 5 or 6 weeks, but all the way up to like 10 weeks. It really just depends on like what core group of skills we're covering. So I'll give the unit assessment because again, that's going to help me determine, do we keep going? Do I go back? What do I do? Now, let's say that like 80%-ish or more of your students have shown proficiency. So 80% have gotten 80% or better on the end of unit exam. Great. What you can do is move on with the whole class, assuming you're teaching whole class. And then for those that are still struggling a little bit, you can just kind of supplement that with small group instruction. Just do more of the types of practice that you have been doing to make sure that they eventually do master those skills, because that's super important. We don't just want to breeze on and forget about it, right? Okay, so that's one scenario. In that scenario, most of your kiddos really would have understood, and mastered the concepts that you just taught in the unit. Okay, now let's talk about another scenario. Maybe like half to 75% of your students, showed proficiency on this end of unit, which is, again, that's not the end of unit, but imagine it's an end of unit assessment. Great. I wouldn't necessarily move on to the next unit immediately if that's the case. Instead, what I would do is pause for like a couple of days or maybe even a week and reteach the skills that are needed. If you use a diagnostic assessment like we have in From Sounds to Spelling, you'll be able to pinpoint, and hopefully the kids are somewhat on the same page with what they struggled with, right? You'll be able to see, oh, well, they struggled with this. I need to spend more time on review. And then just kind of like see how it goes. You don't necessarily need to reassess, like give the whole unit assessment again, but you kind of want to see through your daily activities that the kids are doing better with the patterns that they struggled with. Again, of course, you can supplement with small groups, and then when you're ready to move on, continue to supplement with small groups for any kids that still need more review. On the topic of review, I feel like I'm going down so many rabbit holes in this video. Review is really important for all kids. So even when they demonstrate mastery, you still got to come back and in future units, just continue to practice the skills that you've already taught. In From Sounds to Spelling, my phonics program, we absolutely do that. It's built in for you. I hope that whatever phonics program you're using, that it does it for you as well. If you need a phonics program, by the way, it's fromsoundstospelling.com. Coming back to what we were doing, so many rabbit holes today. Now, we talked about like, okay, most of the kids, like half to 3/4 of the kids showing proficiency. Now let's talk like under half of the class. As you can imagine, you're not going to want to move forward if under half of the class demonstrated proficiency. Now, if some of your kids are like showing signs of boredom, they're ready to move on, you don't necessarily have to hold everybody back, but you would, in that case, definitely want to implement a lot of focused small group instruction for those students that didn't master the skills. And then you might just want to start doing most of your phonics instruction in a small group so that those higher kids can really work on what they need to. I know that every teacher does their phonics instruction and sets up their day differently, so it's just kind of, based on if you're doing it whole class, small group. But I would say that the bigger division you have in your class, the more there is a need for small group instruction. Doesn't mean that you can't teach whole group, it's just that you're going to want to supplement in small group, whether that's to review or to challenge some of your kiddos. Okay, I think I've covered everything that I wanted to cover in this video. Don't forget to let me know in the comments if you have a diagnostic assessment like that. Super curious to hear. And again, if you want that free phonics scope and sequence link, in case you don't have one, there's going to be a link that goes along with this video so that you can grab that, again, totally free. Thanks so much for watching. I do hope this was helpful. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.